1.4 is going to be hopefully straightforward, talking about profit. And this is something that we previewed a little bit in the last video when we talked about expenses and revenue. We had talked about how to find the price that I would need to sell something at to make a certain profit. Well, we're going to talk about this in a little more generality. The only thing we need to know when we talk about profit in general is this equation right here, where so P is profit, R is of course revenue, and E is expenses. You've seen something like this before. I told you about it in 1.3. But now we're going to use it as a function of price, right? This is just a function of price. And we're going to graph it so we can actually do some more with it than we originally had thought we could do. So this is a function of price. So here's my example. Suppose the expenses of a product can be modeled by this function right here. And the revenue for that same product can be modeled by this function right here. And I want to find the profit function, graph it, and do some things with it. Well, if I want to find the profit function, all I'm going to do is go back to this P equals R minus E business. And I'm going to substitute in my R. And then I'm going to substitute in my E. And then I'm going to simplify. So I'm going to get negative 500p squared. If I distribute my negative, right, this becomes positive, positive, negative. So we get negative 500p squared plus 33,500p minus 238,000. So this is the profit function, capital P, in terms of price, lowercase p. I know it gets a little confusing, so you really want to be clear with the way that you write it out. The next thing I want to do is graph the function, right? I want to use my calculator and find at what price the profit is maximized and what the maximum profit is. So we're back at it with kind of my makeshift camera stand here for my calculator, and we're going to talk about graphing this function now. So I've got my profit function all calculated, right? We had just done that. So I'm going to go ahead and enter this into my calculator. And remember, I'm being careful to use x for my variable always on my calculator because the other letters of the alphabet are being used just to store numbers. So once I have it entered, I also want to set my calculator window. And this is something that I'm going to have to give you for every single problem that I have you do maximum for. And that's because in order to find the window, you actually have to solve the problem. So you would be doing all the work anyway. So normally I would give you this, but you're going to just press window, enter in your max values for x and y. You don't need to do anything with the scale because you're just going to get press graph. And maybe I should actually shrink this a little bit more. Let's see here. Oh, I got a 350,000. Yeah, that's much better. Okay, so sometimes it's a little bit of guess and check, but that's okay. And so here's our function, and now we're just going to second and calc. We want maximum, right? So we want to go to number 4. And then we're asking for the left bound and right bound, and with the way that I set my window, it's really hard to see where that maximum is, but we do know that it's somewhere up here. So I'm going to start by going up to the peak, and of course for left bound, I want to be a little bit to the left of the peak. If you remember from the last time we've done this, that what you're kind of telling the calculator, I'm doing this again for right bound, is somewhere in between the left and right bound is the maximum, right? Somewhere between the left and right bound is the maximum. I'm not going to guess, so I'm just going to press enter, and then there's my maximum. Remember that our calculator doesn't always round perfectly, so this is obviously $33.50, and then my maximum profit is here as well. My last step is to graph revenue, expense, and profit on the same set of axes. And by doing that, I also want to find out, well, what do these points where the profit is 0 mean? And what does the maximum profit mean in terms of revenue and expense? So to save some time, I did this using Desmos, and I think it's also a little bit easier to follow when it's on Desmos. So we have profit in green. So here's my profit function. Here is my profit function. So what do these 0 profit points mean? They're right here. Well, if I actually look and if I follow, I kind of wish I had a pointer here and I don't. If I follow this point 8.079 upwards, I actually get to this point up here, right? And you can kind of see that it's the same exact price. Well, remember that the intersection between revenue and expense is called the break-even point, and if I'm breaking even, then the amount I'm making is the same as the amount it's costing me, which means my profit is also 0. So the 0 profit points are where, and maybe I can shift back over to my notes. So the 0 profit points are the break-even points. This is where revenue and expense are equal, right? Because then my profit, which is revenue minus expense, and if they're equal, is 0. So what does the maximum profit mean? Here is my maximum profit right there. And we just calculated this by hand, right? $33.50. The maximum profit point is, well, if we kind of look, if I were to find the differences between revenue and expense, the red and the blue, for this whole function, throughout the entire function, this is the point where the revenue function is furthest away from the expense function. It's the greatest distance, the greatest difference between revenue and expense. That's not necessarily the maximum revenue point, right? We can see that my maximum revenue point is actually a little bit lower. But it represents the greatest distance or the greatest difference between revenue and expense. So maybe I can go back to my notes and write that in also. And I'll say max profit point is the greatest distance, which is the same as the greatest difference, or difference between revenue and expense. So there's not a whole lot of new content in this section, right? Because we've learned how to find the maximum of a parabola before on our calculators. Maybe this new look at revenue, expense, and profit altogether is new, but hopefully a lot of this will feel familiar.